Welcome to the Personality Couch podcast, where we discuss all things personality and clinical practice. I'm your host, Doc Bach, and I'm here with my lovely co-host, Doc Fish. We are both licensed clinical psychologists in private practice, and today we are continuing our series on narcissism. So we have been talking about pathological narcissism broadly. But in this episode, we are going to discuss a few nuances to pathological narcissism and how it is expressed. Particularly, we'll be distinguishing among covert, overt, grandiose, and vulnerable narcissism as they relate to constructs inside all pathological narcissists. I am so excited about this episode. Let's jump in. All right, Doc Fish, as we start to unpack these terms, help me remember what pathological narcissism actually is.
Sure thing. So pathological narcissism happens when you can't regulate or achieve needs for admiration and validation to the extent that self-enhancement or increasing positive self-image is the goal of life in most or even all situations.
Oof.
Even if it means exploiting others.
Ooh, yikes. So this is why narcissistic relationships can be so toxic, because there's really only room for one ego in the relationship, and it ain't yours. So while this toxicity sometimes is really obvious when it's like, ugh, enough already, like stop with the self-obsession, sometimes it's not so obvious. So there are times when narcissism is literally hiding in plain sight. Like sometimes the warning label seems like maybe it peeled off, so you don't know what all is in that toxic personality barrel because you can't see inside it. And there's nothing on the outside that would tell you otherwise. There's no warning signs until there are. So this is where we have to distinguish between overt and covert narcissism.
Now, this is a bit tricky since our field has a habit of misusing psych terms. We're not very original with names.
I'm just thinking, it's a good thing God didn't ask a shrink to name the animals. Like, it's a duck, it's a duck, it's a duck, duck, duck. Can you imagine how confusing that would be?
That's hilarious. Oh my goodness. Okay. But the main thing that we need to emphasize here is that we are not talking about subtypes. Not today.
That is a riveting episode yet to come. So one thing that we have to think about is that with all personality issues, there can be stuff that we keep to ourselves or maybe aren't aware of. And there's behavior that's observable to others. So the measurable stuff is the overt stuff, or the stuff that people see, right? So then there's the stuff that the people can't see that's under the surface. This is the covert stuff. Okay, so remember the toxic personality barrels I mentioned? So think about it like this. Are there signs on the outside about what lies within? Is it leaking green gas? Do you see bubbles? Is there an odor? Is there a hazmat warning label, right? If so, that's the overt stuff. It's giving you clues about what's inside the personality barrel. It's observable. It's easy to see. But there can be toxic, narcissistic stuff inside a personality barrel, and you don't even know it yet. That's covert. No bubbles, no leaking, no smell, no warning label, no outward indicators.
So overt is observable and often behavioral. So an example would be recognizing the arrogance and seeing the exploitation of others, maybe as they rant about how they're the best worker ever. But then covert looks just like a normal personality barrel. It's the stuff that the person keeps to themselves, like their wishes, desires, thoughts, fantasies. We can't see it, but it's just as narcissistic. Like it's just as toxic.
Yeah.
Okay, so an example might be maybe like a running narrative in their head as they think about how great they are and deserve the world, but they don't actually say it out loud.
Exactly. Yeah, the covert. If they don't say it out loud, it's just a thought. But if they do say it out loud, then all of a sudden, that's overt. If you happen to find yourself surprised when someone consistently starts acting in an extreme narcissistic way, it's likely that the covert, under the surface, narcy thoughts and desires have been there the whole time. So maybe there's been covert grandiosity there. An example might be thoughts such as, like, why can't people just notice me? So once that thought of, well, why can't people just notice me, leads to behavior and lashing out, now you're starting to see the leaky green sludge from the personality barrel. You guessed it. Narcy has likely been there the whole time.
Oh, wow. Okay. And to be clear, we're not just talking about a bad day or a bad few weeks. Pathological narcissism, whether covert or overt, is going to be a pattern. So it's possible that it hasn't leaked out in your circumstance yet. So maybe like at work when everything's going well and they're top dog and their thoughts and fantasies of grandiosity are hidden, but reinforced by their environment. But then under different circumstances or given new stressors, you or others might have seen narcissism pop up at different points across the lifespan.
Right. That is a great example. Yeah. So someone with pathological narcissism is going to have both overt and covert narcy stuff going on. Or essentially the thoughts and fantasies that are narcissistic that lead to the narcissistic behavior. And where you are in their timeline might just mean that you haven't seen the overt stuff yet until you do.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take this a level deeper and look at grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. Let's move away, if you will, from the toxic barrel analogy, move away from the barrels. Each pathological narcissist has grandiose and vulnerable themes. So while some theorists have made grandiose and vulnerable personality categories, as in subtypes or types of narcy, more recent personality experts in the past 15 years have said that both vulnerable and grandiose themes exist in varying degrees within each pathologically narcissistic person. Okay, so let's think of this like each one has a volume dial. Grandiose has a volume dial, and vulnerable has a volume dial. Okay. So pathological narcies will have varying levels of each, and they may go up and down depending on the tune of life.
Gotcha. Okay. And then Pincus and Roach, so two researchers, say that grandiose themes fluctuate with vulnerable themes and that emotional dysregulation goes up and down too within the same individual, highlighting that emotional dysregulation may be an additional dial that influence these themes. Now, Kernberg, 2009, also stated that pathologically narcissistic individuals have bouts of insecurity, disrupting their sense of grandiosity and or specialness. So note here that insecurity is the vulnerable theme.
That is really interesting. Okay, so why the constant changes and switches though?
Horowitz, 2009, stated because grandiosity cannot be maintained, narcissists are more vulnerable to shame, panic, helplessness, or depression as life progresses.
That is so interesting because they can't reject their own imperfections forever. Like life doesn't work that way, right? So this leads to turning up the volume on a more vulnerable facet of themselves when they have to face that truth. Wow. Okay, let's get into these grandiose and vulnerable volume dials a little bit more. So let's start with the more well-known theme. So that's the grandiose theme. The vibe of this theme is, look at me. I'm so wonderful, beautiful, amazing, talented, the best, deserving, rich, etc., etc. But then for the vulnerable theme, instead of look at me, it's woe is me. I'm the victim here. Everyone is out to get me. So again, both are present in the same person, and the volume levels can go up and down depending on the situation. And then, of course, sometimes a person may favor one dial over the other, but the narcissistic person has access to both dials since it's all part of the same narcissistic personality structure.
Now, sometimes there's an abrupt and intense volume switch where one goes up and the other goes down. It's usually seen as the grandiosity going down and the vulnerability going up, which can be called a victim switch. So the woe is me will get really loud, but the shiny, like, look at me, that goes down.
Yes. And this is usually in the face of an ego threat, like, well, I'm the victim now.
Also notable is that the switching happens with aging and loss of power and image.
Ooh.
Yeah. So Kernberg says, with the onset of middle age and its threatening reminders of life's limitations, however, the two types of narcissistic personalities tend to switch places.
Ooh, that is so interesting. Okay, this makes sense because if one theme hasn't been working for you for decades and you're faced with your own mortality or declining beauty or health, you're trying other levers to gain power back and not face your own imperfections.
Ooh, I wonder if this has anything to do with a midlife crisis.
It could. I can see how that would lead to a midlife crisis for pathological narcissists. So I do think it's important to note that grandiose themes and vulnerable themes inside an individual each have overt qualities that are observable and covert qualities that are quiet and in their thoughts and fantasies. So in other words, there's a lot of different ways in which pathological narcissism can show up and take shape.
Or lurk behind the shadows in dormancy before the next stressor brings it out.
Truth. Okay, so let's talk specifically about that grandiose dial, since that's what most people think of when they think of narcissism.
Okay, so then what is narcissistic grandiosity?
Yeah, so personality theorists define this in a few ways. It's a need for self-enhancement or positive self-image, and it's characterized by unhelpful motives to enhance the self, which of course means it's image-based and they exaggerate things to better their image. And it's a constant pursuit to increase and what I call fluffify their image. Again, everything comes back to image, right? And with that, so social charm is key here. Despite the fact that they exploit others, the social charm lets them kind of get away with some of these things, which of course then it would make sense that narcissistic grandiosity is associated with extroversion. But Doc Fish, tell me about what other traits are associated with grandiose narcissism from the research.
Sure, my pleasure. Grandiose narcissism is often described with words such as conceit, arrogance, domineering, because there's a preoccupation with attention and admiration from others. So, looking at specific research articles, we found that narcissistic grandiosity is associated with insensitivity towards others, aggression, outspokenness, being a show-off, being egotistical, assertiveness, and of course, not being modest.
Yeah, sounds like being a jerk.
Yeah.
You don't care about others. You're aggressive, not humble, not my idea of a BFF.
I would hope not, but there's more.
Okay, tell me more.
Narcissistic grandiosity is also associated with hostility and interpersonal problems involving intrusion and boundary crossing.
Ooh, okay.
They can often exhibit dominant behavior when they're threatened with others' dominance.
Huh.
So basically, like if there's a threat to status, they feel a need to reassert their superiority.
Okay, so whose male anatomy's bigger, right?
Yeah.
Power up, show more hypermasculinity.
It's also correlated with anger and negative emotions in the face of failure regarding achievement. So, for example, not getting the job promotion, the raise, or the desired evaluation score. But the kicker here is that this doesn't happen if they face an interpersonal failure or rejection.
Ooh.
Spoiler alert, it's opposite for the vulnerable dial.
Okay. So interesting. We'll get to that part in a minute about the vulnerable piece. But it's interesting that it's about image or the achievement, not about the relationship. And if the achievement failure happens in public, it's even worse for them, which leads to even worse behavior. Okay. So they'll tantrum if they don't achieve the thing that's in their sights.
Exactly. So interestingly and oppositely, grandiose narcissism is also associated with more positive emotions.
Ooh, okay. Because they're narcissistic and just don't care.
Yeah.
What could possibly make them unhappy? They're great. They feel great. They look great. They are great. But when that greatness isn't recognized or perhaps isn't achieved, they can feel guilt. But they don't often access pride or shame. Okay, so definition time. Guilt is about specific situations and behaviors. So, for example, I value success and I didn't get that job, leading to guilt. Shame is related to the entire self and fundamental badness. So an example might be, I am bad and flawed, which is why I didn't get the job.
Okay.
So grandiose narcissism is correlated with guilt, which is more behavioral, not shame, which is more internal.
Right, because they run from shame.
Exactly. Yep. So when they fail to obtain their need for self-enhancement and positive image, there's also an increased risk for depression and suicide attempts.
So those are some emotional pieces, but there's also thoughts. There's a positive correlation with entitlement. So that is the belief that one should be able to do or have whatever one wants, regardless of what others consider reasonable or the cost to others.
Gosh, it sounds like a child, right? Like, but mom, I wanted it.
Oh, exactly.
Very regressed.
Now, there's a negative correlation with defectiveness. So this means that like the self is not defective. The self is perfect. So again, it's the belief that one is not defective and is not unlovable at some fundamental level, right? Because we're running from that.
Okay.
Now, this is the stuff that's under the surface, the covert grandiosity, the thoughts that give rise to the overt behavior.
I see. And grandiose narcissism typically views the self highly, which is why it's correlated with increased self-esteem. And side note, some personality theorists even say that narcissism is similar to an addiction to high self-esteem.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And interestingly, cocaine addiction overlaps with high narcissism, seeking that dopamine and stimulation, which interestingly, Freud also was believed to have a cocaine addiction. Moving on. Bipolar also overlaps, as the manic or hypomanic states achieved organically in bipolar feed the need for high self-esteem and superpowers.
Ooh, yeah. So one of the criterion listed under mania or hypomania episodes is, quote, inflated self-esteem or grandiosity.
Yes.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So an example might be like the notion of, I can get that all done with 2 hours of sleep in a week. I'm amazing. It's interesting that there's something going on organic to the psyche and possibly neuropsychological functioning that impacts both mood and personality here.
Exactly. And more research has found grandiose narcissism is associated with mania and violence. although violence is only really associated with males.
Wow.
And staying on that darker train of thought, it's also associated with criminal behavior and gambling.
Oh, dopamine. I need to stay high and stimulated. Of course. Of course. Okay, so let's talk about vulnerable narcissism. Sometimes this is harder to detect because it's not always so shiny and, shall I say, obnoxious?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
So, unfortunately, our culture seems to favor the more grandiose theme because it's more in your face. But there's an underbelly to that facade. Like, we focus on the face of Mount Rushmore and all of its grandeur, but does it have a backside? I mean,
oh gosh,
does it?
The butts. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you for this card many, many years ago that I just showed to the camera for our listeners of the backside of Mount Rushmore. Anyway, all kidding aside, that's vulnerable narcissism, the backside of grandiose. Less shiny, equally as narcissistic.
Essentially, according to researcher Wink in 1991, these two themes of grandiose and vulnerable exist within one person through the use of the defense mechanism called splitting, where the narcissist manages to keep the two conflicting feelings about the self away from conscious awareness.
Exactly. Yeah. So basically, within one person, you have the shiny, plastic, better than you, dominant theme juxtaposed against a fragile, less confident, victim-y, moody, bitter, insecure theme. So these themes within the narcissistic personality exist, even though they're opposite, because the narcissistic individual splits them off in the unconscious.
Right, which is denial.
Yes. Yeah. So they typically, and especially without treatment, stay unaware of both, leading to a constant internal conflict that is projected to the outside world.
Because awareness would be too threatening to existence.
Exactly. Yeah. So one researcher, Akhtar, said that hidden underneath that grandiosity, exhibitionism, envy, and ambition can be a superficial facade of modesty and shyness.
Right. Basically showing how both vulnerable and grandiose themes can exist within one person. Those are opposites. So it's like fake modesty covering up grandiosity.
Exactly. Yeah. So now sometimes it can also be a reaction to the narcissistic grandiosity for the purpose of disguising it by looking pitiful. But the goal is still the same. It's an attempt to obtain that narcissistic supply, which is especially seen in some of these more vulnerable themes.
Right, because narcissistic vulnerability comes out in response to ego threats or failures to maintain a positive self-image. Pincus and Roche noted that narcissistic vulnerability is reflected in experiences of anger, aggression, helplessness, emptiness, shame, low self-esteem, and, of course, avoidance of interpersonal relationships and interpersonal problems.
Whoa, okay, that's a lot. It's not shiny. And it's leading to people problems with relationships. So we're still seeing the anger and aggression, similar to grandiose, but we've lost this high self-esteem.
Right. And it's also correlated with exploitation of others and to attachment anxiety and avoidance. So those with vulnerable narcissism often recall their appearance as cold and psychologically intrusive, and they report a history of abuse. However, the type of abuse was not differentiated. So we have to take that into consideration.
That is really fascinating. Okay. And grandiosity isn't correlated with any of these.
Correct.
So it's a different type of narcissism. It's still narcissism, but a different kind of flavor, a different theme that's coming out and maybe in response to how they were parented.
Also common in more vulnerable themes are things like pessimism, lack of fulfillment, and vulnerability to life's traumas.
Yeah, there it is. That fragility, an air of persecution, like easily being affected by difficult things in life. This is very victim-y. Yeah, vulnerable is victim-y.
Yeah, vulnerable narcissism is also associated with moodiness, but more negative emotions and less positive emotions. And these negative emotions include anxiety symptoms like worry, paranoid ideation, overall distress.
And some of these may be under the surface. Like you may not always be able to see the worry because it may be covert under the surface.
Yes. True. Now, it also includes depression, suicide attempts, and parasuicidal behavior. And then all of these things lead to interpersonal issues such as envy, bitterness, hostility, and immaturity, as well as defensiveness, argumentativeness, and interpersonal sensitivity.
Right. Okay. This again is why it's associated with relationship problems and avoidance of relationships. So it's a reaction to the shame. So they keep others at arm's length, even though they need them for narcissistic supply.
Yeah. And vulnerable themes are associated with increased shame and ego, but less pride. So there's no correlation to guilt. And if you remember, grandiose themes were correlated with guilt, but not shame.
Yeah, that is so interesting. It's the inverse. The mirror has two faces. And we're seeing the opposite of grandiose again, but it's still just as narcissistic.
Exactly. Now, regarding thoughts, which is covert, vulnerable narcissism is associated with subjugation. So believing that the preferences of others are more important than personal desires. Also correlated with unrelenting standards. So that's the belief that one must meet unrealistically high standards.
These are things you wouldn't necessarily think are part of narcy. Things like perfectionism, maybe not being easily pleased, like kind of the chronic complainers, the malcontents, like nothing's ever good enough, it's never enough, or like darn if you do, darn if you don't.
It's also associated with emotional inhibition. So that's the belief that the expression of emotions will result in negative consequences, such as embarrassment or harm to others.
Emotion is weakness, so keep it to myself.
Now, it's negatively correlated to dependence. That means there's a belief that one does not need considerable help from others to manage everyday responsibilities.
Sure. Here again is that defensive self-sufficiency, or I can do it myself.
Right.
Yep. So keeping with that victim-y stance, vulnerable narcissism is also correlated with increased anger and negative emotions when faced with interpersonal rejection. And it's worse if the threat is private. So if you recall, this is opposite of the grandiose themes, where interpersonal rejection was not as big a deal as public rejection. Here in vulnerable narcissism, behavior worsens if the threat is private. So, for example, in vulnerable narcissism, if there is a divorce or rejection in a romantic relationship, the anger and the negative emotions increase, especially behind closed doors, versus anger increasing if not getting the job or the elected office, which is more public, as it is in grandiosity.
Goodness. Okay. Other associated concerns include sleep disturbance and psychosis, or breaks with reality.
Ooh, wow.
Likely because of all that anxiety. There's a lot weighing on their mind.
So this correlation with psychosis is especially interesting. And I think, as you said, I wonder if all the psychological distress there is leading to more susceptibility to severe mental health issues. Especially grandiose narcissism isn't correlated with negative emotions because they just don't care. Like they're the greatest, end of story. But vulnerable seems to be more in touch with this victim-y stance and maybe with that darker emotions that carry a heavy weight and a heavy price tag.
Sure. And taking it even darker, instead of violence, like in Grandiose Narcissism, there's a more subtle criminal behavior. For example, one article from Menard and Pincus in 2012 found that if a male has vulnerable narcissism and a history of childhood sexual abuse, they're more likely to engage in overt stalking and cyberstalking.
Oh my. Okay, so stalking because they aren't confident enough to trick the female into dating them because
Sure.
there's no charm there. Oh, yikes.
Yep. Probably couldn't handle the rejection. Okay. So we discussed the differences between grandiose and vulnerable narcissistic themes. But of course, there's still some overlap because there's still both pathological narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of those similarities?
Yeah, there's actually a bit of overlap here. So as we've said, both are prone to people problems, as shown by self-indulgence and disregard for the needs of others. That's going to get in the way of relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
Exploitativeness and entitlement also don't bode well for people. And then bossiness, demandingness, intolerance, argumentativeness, conceit, arrogance, and cruelty. Yeah, these are all relationship killers for sure.
Goodness. Okay. And then both of them also have some unstable themes as well, including depressive tendencies and suicide attempts. Borderline personality disorder also is correlated to both.
Okay.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
And I think this goes along with, it's correlated with abandonment thoughts. So that would be the belief that other individuals will be unable to provide emotional support because they're emotionally unstable or because the individuals will die or abandon the person.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I see how those two would be related, BPD and abandonment thoughts.
And then we also have correlation with mistrust beliefs. So both grandiose and vulnerable narcissism is associated with the belief that others will be abusive and manipulative.
Wow. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of other personality disorder correlates here in some of these things, which of course is going to happen because, as we always say, any personality disorder is going to have a healthy dose. The first ingredient in that personality disorder is going to be high pathological narcissism. So specifically, this BPD piece is interesting to me because narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder, or BPD, are both in the cluster B category in the DSM. So because they're in the same category, they're going to have a lot of overlap. They're in the dramatic and erratic category is what we call it. But it's interesting. You can especially see some of those vulnerable themes showing up in borderline with how in touch they are with their pain. And then to some of the research that pointed to vulnerable narcissism overlapping with more psychosis or psychotic symptoms, borderline can slip into that psychotic space, even if it's, transient psychosis or just kind of dipping their toe in there and coming back to reality. But I'm seeing how this research kind of comes together with some of the other personality disorders in the DSM.
Interesting. So what you're saying is we should learn about all the personality disorders.
Yes. And where narcissism is in all of them.
Yes. Okay.
So summing it all up, grandiose and vulnerable themes can be under the surface and covert, or in your face and overt. Many of these terms have also been used as subtypes, which makes it super confusing. But our focus today was on themes. So grandiose is a more extroverted theme, or pay attention to me, I'm shiny. Whereas the vulnerable theme is the victim-y, less socially adept, insecure underbelly of narcissism. That's the theme there. But both themes exist in the pathologically narcissistic individual, with each one kind of like a volume dial that goes up or down depending on life circumstances. And vulnerable narcissism in particular often comes out with age and when other narcissistic defenses are no longer working. That is fascinating. But for today, we have to wrap up. So thank you for joining us today on this episode of The Personality Couch. Make sure to check out our blogs that coincide with these episodes at www.personalitycouch.com. And as always, don't forget to give us a thumbs up or rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. And on YouTube, hit that bell so you don't miss a single episode in our Narcissism series. Be well, be kind, and we'll see you next time on The Personality Couch. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute a professional relationship. If you're in need of professional help, please seek out appropriate resources in your area. Information about clinical trends or diagnoses are discussed in broad and universal terms and do not refer to any specific person or case.